Welcome to another week of Psych 4421. This week we're going to be focusing on the impact of violent media consumption and its impact and role on individuals' development. So let's get started. So I think it's first important for us to set the tone of what does that term media violence really mean? Well, simply it's actually the exposure, whether it's physical situations, relational, or aggression that we're experiencing through TV, film, video games, digital media, Instagram, TikTok, all the different platforms in which people take in information. So when we think about violence, it can be across many of these different platforms. And overall, within psychological science, scientists and researchers really ask a few specific questions. They're really trying to understand, are the effects age specific? So does it matter if they're exposed at 6 months versus if they were exposed at 6 years versus 16 years versus 26 years? They also want to figure out, are the effects cumulative? Meaning, are the development of effects throughout the lifespan going to greatly impact the more and more we're exposed? And then also, do these early experiences shape the trajectories into adulthood? So these three questions are typically what researchers are asking, and hopefully we'll dive into and get some clarity on some of those things. So if we think about early childhood, so 3 to 6 years old, we really want to identify the impact that observational learning plays on childhood behaviors. If you're familiar with Albert Bandura, he did research on the Bobo doll, where children witness other children either being kind or aggressive to the Bobo doll. Those who viewed the aggressiveness later portrayed the aggressiveness to the doll when it was presented in the room with them, versus those who did not. So that kind of goes into the theory of observational learning, trying to understand and really hone in on, is what children observe something they are going to portray outwards, what they're going to mirror and model. A lot of times during this stage, modeling behavior is utilized because individuals don't necessarily have strong morals and values at this stage in their life. So overall, it's a lot of times difficult for children during this age group to really distinguish between what is real and what is a fantasy. And so they ingest that information very similarly, and to them it's all real. So they don't have that distinguishing factor of real and fake. So if we think of how violent media contributes to certain aspects, we actually have kind of seen it through research that acquisition of aggressive behaviors is actually what they'll eventually model. And it's because the children during this time period are believing that those behaviors, especially if they're viewed by additional adults or even if they're taking in this information from their own parental caregivers, that they believe that this aggression is normalized. So the more we see it, the more normalized it is for children within this age span. And so if we think about it, research does state that early exposure within this time frame does predict and does correlate with externalizing behaviors, whether it's physical aggression, inability to emotionally regulate. So research does state within this time frame that aggressive behaviors and obtaining and kind of taking in media violence as a whole and violence in general does impact behaviors moving forward. Now let's think a little bit about middle childhood, which is our 7 years old to 11-year-old range. So this is where they're establishing social cognition, and also there's kind of the concept of hostile attribution bias. Pretty much in this stage, development of stable peers, so peer relationships, because if we think of what the needs are during this stage, it's approval by peers, immoral reasoning actually start to establish. There is a ability for them to really hone in on the skills of what they believe is right and wrong. And it's greatly related to whether their social relationships will accept or deny them. So if we think about this stage, what we notice and what research kind of has honed in on is that when we are exposed to violent media during this time, it actually increases the hostile attribution bias, which is relatively interesting. And also, they are to expose more physical and relational aggression, especially if they're seeing it over and over again. So there's that linkage, again, similar to early childhood as well. And then also during this time, there's a reduction in prosocial behavior. So I kind of talked about my experiences with the children in the population that I work with full time, and I noticed they struggle in understanding how to make these appropriate decisions when all they have witnessed throughout their life was environmental violence. It could be whether they played video games, but ultimately with my population, it's violence in their neighborhoods, violence in kind of their environments with their families, and ultimately they have less pro-social behavior. They're less likely to self-regulate. They are less likely to engage in self-management skills. They are also very much challenged to implement healthy coping skills, breathing, stopping and pausing before we act, because the aggression behavior has been so normalized. So overall, early childhood and middle childhood, violent media is contributing to aggression behaviors. So now if we think about adolescence, that's about 12 years old to 18 years old. At this state, individuals are really working to formulate their identity, establish who they are, and kind of be their own unique individual. There is definitely a heightened need to be accepted by peers, and there are strict kind of rules in which they need to abide by in order to be liked and wanted and have friends in this realm. Ultimately, during this stage, as we've kind of talked about, autonomy is a big focus. Also, autonomy within the social media space. This is the time of one's development where they want to make their own decisions and what type of social media do they have, what do they kind of want to post on social media, and what does that look like. But overall, if we think of, and research has coined the term by violent media diet, this is kind of the concept of what are they consuming more so on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of times, this violent media diet is definitely associated with aggression, and it also increases their violent behavior overall. So if we think about it, if there's continuous exposure from birth to adolescence, it goes back to what we've been talking about, which is normalization. So there's increased violent behavior. Because they're trying to make their own decisions, they are also trying to be in the in crowd. And so they are, experiencing these violent behaviors more often. And I definitely see this with my kiddos that I work with. Unfortunately, in the community that I work in, adolescent violence is sometimes praised by different subpopulations within their middle and high schools. That can signify that you're cool, that people are scared of you, but it's perceived very positively, which then increases violent behavior moving forward. So now if we think about it from an emerging adulthood, so 19 and kind of up into adulthood, we start to have this stability in that plateau of what these aggressive traits look like. Although things can always change, it is harder once we kind of establish them more concrete as we've developed them through our whole life. So aggression becomes a lot more trait-like and personality related, and it becomes a lot more stable. What that means is triggers may be stable. What aggression looks like is pretty similar across the boards, whether that's fighting, throwing, yelling. I mean, aggression is a very broad term. Longitudinally, researchers have evaluated that childhood violent TV specifically, because if we think about the research that has been done, TV was the primary focus in a lot of those research kind of studies, but that exposure does lead to adult aggressive behaviors. It also is highly associated with criminal outcomes, whether that is violent behaviors association with arrest or kind of making poor choices moving forward. And then it's also linked to domestic violence as well. So as you can see, a lot of these things in early childhood when it comes to consuming violent media greatly do impact into adulthood. So let's jump into some key takeaways as we kind of wrap this up for today. There is ultimately very strong evidence, both by experimental studies and longitudinal studies, that there is consistency that violent media and the consumption of violent media does lead to aggressive and problematic behaviors throughout different aspects of the lifespan. However, it's important for us to identify that there are some moderators, or what I like to consider as extraneous factors or external impacts that are out of our control that can mediate and moderate aggressive behavior. The first one is parenting. The impacts of parenting, whether it's positive or negative parenting, can either have positive or negative impacts on whether a child is going to display those behaviors, whether or not they are digesting violent media. Also, child temperament, whether the child is slow to warm, whether the child is easy to attach and get along with individuals, that is going to be a factor that is going to greatly impact aggressive behaviors moving forward. And then also socioeconomic stress. And that can kind of be many different factors, whether it's the primary caregivers were not really in the home, so the kids had a lot of freedom and flexibility, whether it's the type of neighborhood they live in due to economic factors, whether or not there is also different stressors related to finances. There are so many other different moderators as well that can greatly impact aggression. So this isn't just a child views violent media, therefore they are going to express the aggressive behaviors. Although there is a great association between that, we also have to look at these other characteristics as well. So I know that was very quick. We quickly went through the different lifespans, but as always, reach out if you have questions, and I look forward to seeing your discussion posts for this week.